In keeping with the standard pseudo-medieval fantasy JRPG vibes that Fire Emblem goes for 90% of the time, there are a lot of little, mostly surface-level nods to numerology embedded throughout these games. The most common instances of number-related symbolism are quite easy to pick out because they're everywhere once you start looking for them. There are 12 Crusaders in Yggdrasil, and 3 Arcanean regalia, as well as 3 heroes in Tellius, and 7 plus either 1 or 2 divine weapons in Alib. And then there's 4, which is a number that shows up all over the place and has vastly different symbolic meanings depending on whether your cultural context is Japanese or European. Not surprisingly, this extends to the Fodlan games as well, even down to their titles. Or the first 2 anyway. Fortune's Weave is just one big question mark at the moment. There are 3 houses at Garreg Mach after all. There's actually 4 houses and 4 routes, and if you combine that with 3 hopes, there's really 7 full routes total. 3, 4, 7, and 12 all have very well-known numerological significance, so they're useful for recurring motifs. But then there's the total number of crest in Fodlan. This is never explicitly spelled out in the games, but unlike their closest in-series inspiration, the 12 types of holy blood in Yggdrasil, there are 22 crest, which is not immediately evocative of much. But as the title of this video indicates, and as any source of Three Houses trivia online will probably tell you, the crests do have a real-world occult inspiration, the 22 major arcana of tarot. This isn't tough to work out, even if the game never calls much attention to the crest as a collective entity. And here I'm talking about crest as symbols and game mechanics, not as something that allegedly matters to the plot, even if they actually don't outside of the occasionally badly handled lore dump. But the crests as an ordered list neatly correspond to the major arcana. You can even see them in their appropriate order in the symbol that appears whenever phases change in combat, where all of the crests appear in a circle. Now, I will say up front that I've never been an occult gay, although I am a Scorpio sun born on a witch's Sabbath from a city that is notorious for dubiously authentic occult expressions. So in a way, I'm just the right person to tackle a subject like this. Hell, I'm even Catholic, which is superficially relevant to the Fodlan games, and is more relevant than you might initially think in discussions of tarot depending on the decks you're using. I'm mostly pulling from the Tarot de Marseille, not just because I'm pretentious and French, but because there are certain names and elements of the Italian and French tarot traditions that were not directly translated into later English decks, elements that can have some bearing on how we read tarot into Three Houses. After all, when Intelligent Systems got to making their own Fire Emblem-themed tarot cards for Engage, they gave them all French names, at least in English, which raises the odd implication that the French language exists in this universe. Anyway though, the broader takeaway before we get into individual arcana is that there are many facets to tarot, from its use in ordinary card games, to a fortune-telling device frequently referenced in pop culture with varying degrees of accuracy, to a giant pileup of occult symbology that I'm certain was not meant to be read into the Fodlan games in its entirety, but that nonetheless is suggestive of all sorts of fascinating character elements. So sit back, grab your preferred neo-pagan paraphernalia, and settle in for probably the closest I'll ever come to doing a Halloween video. Let's talk tarot in Fire Emblem Three Houses. If there's a crest you're likely to need a reminder about, it's the Crest of Ernest, because it's the only one to not be attached to any notable Fodlan lore figure, and in fact only appears on the most forgettable iteration of playable Anna in all of Fire Emblem. This actually matches its corresponding major arcana perfectly though, even down to the fact that it's not numbered in the oldest decks, and thus stands apart from the 21 that are. Originally dubbed Le Ma, and later and more recognizably Le Fou, the first of the major arcana comes with a variety of cultural associations from street performers and beggars to the jesters that evoke the Joker wildcard of later playing card decks. The ties to Anna here go almost without saying, even before you slap on her unique alternate costume lifted from Awakening's Trickster. She's a zany comic relief character who hangs out in marketplaces and offers her services to anyone willing to pay her. Her flexible loyalties and paid DLC status align nicely with the Fool both in card games, where it can serve just about any role depending on the particular rule set, as well as with what it represents in fortune-telling. This is because the major arcana as a whole are conceptualized as a sequential journey undertaken by the Fool, a figure who is positioned as the journey's protagonist while also existing outside the scope of the rest of the arcana. And remember how I pointed out that 22 is a weird number to work with? Well, remove the Fool and that number drops to 21. 3 lines of 7, each of which comes with its own collective meaning. As for Three Houses' very own Fool, Anna is nowhere near a protagonist, but she is the game's most overt link to the rest of Fire Emblem. She and her identically named sisters travel through the worlds of the franchise plying their trade, innocent and a bit manic and largely apathetic to anything that isn't money, traits that can also variously be ascribed to the Fool. To get even more meta about it, Anna was dropped from the playable roster in Three Hopes, and with her the only natural bearer of the Crest of Ernest. Fittingly so, since that's a Koei Tecmo-led spin-off rather than a mainline Fire Emblem game. Granted, she's also one of the less popular non-student characters, so it's not that unusual that she's back to being an NPC, but it's a neat coincidence. The Crest of Ernest might miss out on a playable appearance in Three Hopes, but in that sense it's really just swapped out for the Crest of Macule. In Three Houses, Macule is the only crest that does not appear on any playable unit, instead only showing up on its draconic namesake. The spin-off rectifies this, with not only a new sacred tome tied to Macule, but also a character bearing his crest in Monica. The real one, that is, not Kronya masquerading as a dead student. In its description, Macule's crest is said to be tied to magic, and to wind magic in particular. This fits the dragon himself, who is referred to as the Wind Caller, and who appears in Claude's paralogue, which is of course exclusive to Verdant Wind. It's less apt for Monica, who is indeed a mage by default, but who learns no wind magic. The extent to which the magical focus of this crest is reflected in its corresponding arcana depends on which deck you're using. The original name is Le Bateleur, evoking both in name and in visual signifiers sleight of hand or stage magic. English, on the other hand, removes any ambiguity and just calls it the Magician. Either way, the figure is depicted before a table bearing various implements, sometimes tied to the 4 suits that comprise the minor arcana of tarot: cups, pentacles, wands, and swords. There are also elements suggesting deception or something unseen, like how the figure will sometimes be drawn with one too many fingers on one hand, or how the 4th table leg is not visible and is only implied. As the first arcana in the initial sequence of 7, Le Bateleur begins the theme of focus on the self, of showing the Fool all that lies within them and all their possibility. This manifests in the simplest reading of the arcana, that it represents potential in a person, talents that may be expressed if drawn upright, or not lived up to if drawn reversed. Both of those readings apply to the characters with the Crest of Macule. Monica's potential is either tapped or not, depending on which continuity you're in, since she's, dead in Three Houses. When she is in play, Monica is instrumental in exposing the plans of those who slither in the dark, and, at least in Scarlet Blaze, altering the trajectory of Edelgard's plans such that she can take power on her own without needing her EDM-loving allies anymore. Macule himself was the craftiest of the 4 saints, a blend of the mundane and the magical also shown in the arcana. He furthermore serves as a step on the path to Claude realizing his potential, hinting at the relationship between Crest, the Nabateans, and the 10 elites that will be spelled out by Rhea later on in Verdant Wind. As regards the deceptive qualities of Le Bateleur, the most obvious connection is how Kronya pretends to be Monica, but I do also enjoy the meta reading of the Crest of Macule itself in Houses, that in that game it is absent from the playable roster, and its existence is only acknowledged at all on the boss of a paralogue available in just one route. Then it switches places with the Crest of Ernest in Three Hopes, which neatly supports the close relationship between their respective arcana, a common ground born of skill, sleight of hand, and the boundless potential that comes from being the first two cards in a lengthy sequence. Alright, time for a fun one, and moreover, one that will thoroughly justify my decision to include non-English language tarot decks in the conversation. In the Tarot de Marseille, the second major arcana is dubbed La Papesse, literally translated the female pope, or popess, I think that's a word? Just so we're clear, there has never been a female pope in the history of the Catholic Church. Our clerical hierarchy specifically prohibits that. Although there are at least two medieval accounts of women who may have taken on that role owing to unusual and heretical circumstances. Hence why it doesn't seem that odd that the legendary figure of a female pope would have made it into the iconography of tarot. Decks that refer to this arcana as La Papesse can be quite on the nose about the imagery too, depicting the woman wearing the papal tiara or the keys to the kingdom of heaven that appear on the papal emblem. I point all this out because when this arcana was translated into English, it got a decidedly less Catholic gloss, being renamed the High Priestess and depicted with symbols drawn from paganism and Freemasonry, like the moon and the two pillars of the porch of Solomon's temple. Still, I wanted to point out that distinction because it ties into why I would bother with this big preface. Fodlan has, in essence if not an actual title, a female pope. And not only does Rhea possess the crest of Saros, but she is Saros. This crest is furthermore held by another major female character, Rhea's antagonist and narrative foil, Edelgard. Needless to say, there's a clear binary opposition built into this one. But in spite of that, I would resist the urge to interpret this situation as one of these characters representing La Papesse upright, and the other reversed. I alluded to this earlier, but in tarot, if a card is drawn upside down, its meanings are treated as the inverse of what it would be if drawn upright. Rhea and Edelgard are character foils, and ostensibly represent the two main sides of the conflict in Fodlan, even if the game's actual writing frequently drops the ball there on Rhea's end. But it would probably be accurate to read aspects of La Papesse upright and reversed in both characters. After all, there is quite a bit of symbolic overlap between these two. They're both female autocrats, they both serve to unveil the reality of Fodlan to the player, they're both associated with flowers even down to their shared crest resembling a flower bud, and Three Hopes confirms more or less that they're distant relatives. If we're looking at La Papesse from the perspective of the Fool's Journey, this arcana is associated with practicing reflection and discernment in choosing between various paths. And wouldn't you know it, the Eagle's root split can easily be framed as the player being made to choose between Rhea and Edelgard. As for the meanings of the arcana itself, upright it refers to intuition, mystery, and tenacity, whereas reversed it can indicate secrecy, surface-level knowledge, or passion getting in the way of quiet reflection. How you feel about which of these qualities best fits each of these characters will depend on your position in the discourse that I absolutely refuse to get into in this video. But suffice it to say that both characters are secretive and engage in deception, whether that's Rhea obscuring the truth of the crest and the Nabateans, or Edelgard lying to her allies about the Agarthan nukes and Crimson Flower. Each of them also selectively reveals their knowledge to the player via Byleth in a somewhat heavy-handed romantic context. The contrast between surface-level and deeper knowledge is even manifest in their respective roles in White Clouds, with one of them acting as the red herring to the school mystery plot, with the true antagonist only revealed at the end. Feel free to argue over which is which in the comments. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there is in fact a third bearer of the Crest of Saros, that being Geralt, who got it via magical blood transfusion from Rhea. While the crest connection between Edelgard and Rhea ties directly into their roles in the story, Geralt's crest feels more like a piece of trivia. He does find himself caught between these two women and their secret plotting, being at first very suspicious of Rhea, but also immediately distrusting the Flame Emperor and discouraging Byleth from listening to them. It's probably not a coincidence that he dies in the chapter right after this one. There's less to be said about Geralt's association with Saros in Three Hopes, even though that's the game where he's playable, but that's because Rhea is barely in the spin-off, and Edelgard has no meaningful connection to Geralt in a game where Byleth isn't front and center. I suppose, too, that one could look at Geralt's relationship with Citri and read into it his attraction to the distinctly feminine aspects of La Papesse, as the first female figure in the major arcana, and keeping in mind, of course, that traditional cartomancy readings can be quite heteronormative. But if the gendered aspects of the last one didn't sit well with you, I'm sorry to say that we're in for more of the same here. L'Impératrice, the Empress, embodies maternity, particularly in later depictions that swap out the signs of imperial office befitting the name of the arcana for more naturalistic symbolism and overt references to Venus. The corresponding crest belongs to Annette, who's a little difficult to read directly in this context when she's not even the resident team mom of the Blue Lions, and when her personal conflict revolves around her relationship with her estranged father. Annette's mother, like 95% of all mothers in Fodlan, exists purely off-screen. There are, however, a handful of associations one can reasonably make here. The Empress represents nurturing, and not always in the maternal sense. For the Fool, she is the one to highlight the possibilities of their chosen path with her creativity and abundance, qualities that map quite well onto Annette's boundless enthusiasm and artistic bent. In one instance of a card reverse not always being a negative, the reversed Empress can signify some kind of public rejoicing, or the unraveling of a complicated situation. The former fits Annette to a T, while the latter matches up with her eventual reconciliation with her father, allowing them to be a family again. The natural bent of the Arcana is reflected as well in Annette's end card epithet as the bloomed overachiever. And while this bit isn't actually connected to tarot, it is worth pointing out that Annette's crest is named Dominic, like the Catholic saint who founded the Dominican Mendicant Order, which were notable for their role in medieval scholarship and intellectualism. Appropriately so, considering Annette becomes a teacher in many of her endings. But even with all that under consideration, it's kind of difficult to talk about this arcana without also considering it in light of the one coming up. That being l'Empereur, the Emperor, corresponding to the characters of House Fraldarius and thus Felix. I've never really shipped Felix and Annette, but if you're looking to build a ship manifesto for these two, the Arcana have got you covered. Nevertheless, there is more to this card than just being the male counterpart of l'Impératrice, particularly in later decks where the two display more visual and symbolic divergence. Where the previous Arcana represents creativity and nurturing talents, the Emperor imposes order and structure on those talents, with symbols like a throne made out of rock adorned with ram horns for that sense of solidity, and a classic feminine-masculine dichotomy. This plays out in a straightforward way with Felix's, constructive critiques of Annette's singing in their support line, but it also points to Felix's role as the loudest contrarian in the Blue Lions, whose criticisms push other characters toward growth, even if they're typically not expressed very well. And that growth is reciprocal as well, because bear in mind that Felix's father, Rodrigue, possesses the same crest, and that much of Felix's own development hinges on his complicated relationship to his father and to the chivalric values Rodrigue attempts to embody. In a reading, the Emperor can even just point to something relating to a father figure, to make things even more on the nose. The Arcana reversed, meanwhile, can refer to struggles with authority or a lack of discipline, which manifest in Felix on his potential paths where he strikes out on his own and never properly reckons with either his father or his king/subtextual lover. See, you could get some Demi-Licks bits out of this one if you're willing to squint a little. And since I mentioned the name of the last crest, I should also remark on Fraldarius, which if you take into account how Japanese doesn't distinguish between L and R sounds, could be a sort of rendering of fleur-de-lis. You may recognize this symbol as the one I used for my online handle, which is taken from a design for the flag of French Louisiana, but the fleur-de-lis has many other heraldic significations, including as a historical symbol of the French monarchy, again tying House Fraldarius back to the idea of authority and their relationship to it. They are the shields of Fargus, after all, and much of Felix's character is wrapped up in discovering what that means for him, whether that entails antagonism, cooperation, or a torrid gay romance featuring a penetration joke that's almost too obvious to even bother making is up to the player to interpret. Crests don't really factor into either of my two main OTPs for these games, so cut me some slack here. Here we have the first of the crest of the Ashen Wolves, attributed in the story of Cindered Shadows to the 4 apostles and their ritual of blood resurrection in a special chalice that totally has nothing to do with the Eucharist. Because these crests exist purely as DLC for 3 houses, there's less to pick through here, although Noah in particular benefits from associations with other crests. And also there's a fruit named after Noah, which I guess matters a little bit. As Constance explains, her family concealed their crest by attempting to pass it off as the crest of Macuel instead, since both are magically oriented saints' crest from the Empire. Constance doesn't have any interactions with Monica in Three Hopes to explore that idea further, but it is present. In terms of the Arcana, the crest of Noah aligns with Le Pape, translated as the Pope, but rendered in English decks as the High Priest or the Hierophant. This is the masculine counterpart to the Arcana corresponding to the crest of Saros, and the connection between Constance and Edelgard in particular is one worth mentioning, although the gendered contrast with these two is not as strong as it is between l'Impératrice and l'Empereur. Le Pape, who maintains much of the obviously Catholic iconography even in translation, is not a specifically religious figure in interpretations though. Rather, he represents orthodoxy, history, and tradition, especially in a more high-minded spiritual context, in contrast to the Emperor representing earthly law and order. This is evident with Constance and her magical experimentations, doubly so with the Arcana's reverse signification of originality and breaking from orthodoxy. It's not every day one hears of a noble family earning their title through wacky magical inventions, is it? The upright card, meanwhile, has some negative connotations, like servitude and captivity. Constance is, in a way, so held captive by her noble origins and wanting to reclaim them that she's developed a second personality that is totally uninhibited by her own insecurities, usually for comic effect, but these games aren't great about depictions of mental illness, let's be honest. Constance's duality is reflected in some of the visuals of this Arcana, like the 2 pillars which can represent law and freedom, or obedience and disobedience, and the contrast between the fingers on the hand raised in benediction, 2 up, 2 down, so as to connect the earthly and the heavenly. This is a trait Le Pape shares with Le Bateleur, which has one hand pointed up and another down. And remember, that's the one corresponding to Monica and the crest of Macuel. It's really too bad that these two don't get to interact in the spin-off. It turns out that 2 of Adrestia's greatest crested mages share a lot of symbolism. But we can't forget about the Empire's 3rd crested mage. It's Linhardt, and by extension, the source of the crest of Cethline herself, Flame. It's fitting that this crest is one held by 2 characters, because its equivalent Arcana specifically depicts 2 figures, les amoureux, the lovers. What will likely first come to mind here is the support line between these 2, which ends with Linhardt proposing that they have children together in the name of science. Incredibly skeevy, but incredibly on-brand for both Fire Emblem and Linhardt, yes, but not actually all that far off from this Arcana, which is also affiliated with the zodiac sign Gemini, you know, the twins. A little bit of crest incest is par for the course here. Interesting to note that the Tarot de Marseille includes a 3rd figure joining the lovers in union, which later decks removed to underscore the duality of the scene, and then replaced with some heavy Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden vibes in an uncommon instance of English tarot being more overtly Christian than its earlier counterparts. Unsurprisingly, Les Amoureux are deeply tied to the idea of relationships and romantic love, although there is a bit more at play here. In the Fool's Journey, they represent the freedom that comes from cultivating partnerships and breaking from tradition, for some of that forbidden love angle that also manifests in how Fire Emblem usually depicts its support systems as a reflection of the bonds between your units. And while this isn't really a component of the Arcana, I do find it appropriate that Linhardt and Flayn embody two very different approaches to sexual relationships. Linhardt is detached and scientific, almost to the point of mechanical, whereas Flayn is the kind of starry-eyed romantic you'd expect of a repressed adolescent discovering herself for the first time. The pairing of those two worldviews still isn't what I'd call an entirely comfortable one, but again, that's Fire Emblem for you. Here we come to what might be the most politically complicated crest situation in Fodlan. House Daphnel itself lies within the Leicester Alliance, and it was once one of the Alliance's 5 great houses before it split up and half its members went to the kingdom to form House Galatea. House Daphnel is represented in-game by Judith, who has to win some kind of consolation prize as a fan-favorite character everyone wanted to be playable, only to see Three Hopes keep her stuck in the role of killable NPC for a second time. But Judith lacks not only a place on the roster, but also her family's crest. Instead, it's Ingrid repping the crest of Daphnel, as well as its corresponding relic, so that's who we're primarily focusing on here. De Chariot is the last in the first line of Arcana, one that represents breaking away from established boundaries as we move beyond the self into the understanding of the collective that serves as the theme for the second line. On its own, it has connotations related to conflict, with the possibility of both victory and defeat, although it can also be tied into legal or civil unrest, or alternatively, the boons of providence. All this is to say that this Arcana fits Ingrid fairly well, in part because most of this is standard Fire Emblem stuff. She wants to be a knight to serve the kingdom and honor her late fiancé's memory, but to do so she has to push back against the societal restrictions being placed on her. She wants to grant succor to her family's famine-stricken lands, and she does so not through marriage as her father expects, but through warfare, which of course always results in victory provided she's on your side, since that's how these games work. Come to think of it though, the Chariot matches House Daphnel and its cadet branch as a whole pretty well, what with their divided loyalties creating turmoil for them and their political futures. It even works out nicely that the first non-human figure in the Arcana matches up with a crest held by a character so inclined to be a cavalry unit. If Fortune's Weave doesn't find a way to give a character with the crest of Daphnel that new chariot riding class, I will be sorely disappointed. Why am I now discussing two different crests at the same time? The crest of Blaiddyd and Keyhole aren't even right next to each other in the sequence. Excluding the unnumbered first slot, they're the 8th and 11th crest, respectively. However, there's an interesting quirk regarding the major arcana in these positions that merit talking about them together. In the Tao de Marseille and several other decks, the 8th numbered arcana is La Justice, while the 11th is La Force, Strength. But in the Rider Waite deck, easily the most well-known and influential English deck used for fortune-telling, the positions of these two arcana are switched to better align with certain astrological signs. It's not too difficult to pick out that the developers of Three Houses were working from the Rider-Waite ordering. The crest of Keyhole resembles a balance scale, which is depicted in the Justice Arcana and ties it to the constellation Libra, whereas the Strength Arcana shows a lion, is affiliated with Leo, and corresponds to the crest of Blaiddyd, which is held by the leader of the Blue Lions. Pretty on the nose there. Still, as with some of the translation differences, I did want to point this out since sometimes there might be something worth looking at. Also, these arcana do have something more organic in common, namely that justice and strength are two of the classical cardinal virtues first outlined by Plato in the Republic, and later incorporated into Christian tradition and then, unsurprisingly, into Christian-influenced occult practices. The characters we're talking about here are, as mentioned, Dimitri, as well as Ferdinand and Keyhole himself in the form of Sedith. Beginning with Dimitri, strength is a natural fit for the crest of Blaiddyd, as it makes its bearers supernaturally strong and also break their weapons faster, in literally the only instance of a crest having any kind of negative impact in gameplay. It also aligns with Dimitri's character development, with upright strength standing for power, courage, and magnanimity, whereas strength reversed indicates the abuse of power, weakness, or even disgrace. Depending on the game, route, and point in the story, Dimitri exhibits dramatic turns of all of the above. The iconography of the Arcana, of a person holding open the jaws of a lion, also speaks to Dimitri's character arc as one of needing to overcome an obsessive desire for revenge in search of a higher, more human use for his strength, both physical and political. Given the flexibility of tarot readings, it's not a shock that elements of his character are also manifest in the Justice Arcana, in the pursuit of right over vengeance and in avoiding bias. As regards the astrological associations that the Rider-Waite deck brings in by its reordering, I'll just go ahead and say that I'm not really touching on those here, as this video is already way too long as it is without bringing the Zodiac into it, and also because Dimitri is a Sagittarius on a cusp with Capricorn, not a Leo. Comment down below if you want me to do a follow-up video where I do star sign readings for the Fodlan characters. For the time being, though, let's switch over to the crest of Keyhole. Neither Ferdinand nor Sedith are major characters, so they've got less to work with compared to Dimitri, but nonetheless, both of them embody traits of justice both visually and symbolically. Ferdinand is fixated on nobility as an ideal, while Sedith is the stern, no-nonsense stickler for the rules among Garreg-Mach's staff, both wishing to uphold equity and a sense of right and wrong. Coincidentally, like Dimitri, these characters are primarily lance-focused physical units, although they also have boons and swords to match the metaphorical Sword of Justice displayed in the Arcana. Unlike Flayn and Linhart, Ferdinand and Sedith have no supports or significant interactions, and come Three Hopes they're even locked to different routes to really underscore how each of them is insistent upon being on the right side of their own personal law. There's a bit of all three characters reflected in what these two Arcana indicate for the Fool's journey, with Strength advocating thoughtfulness and planning, and Justice emphasizing not just fairness and equality, but also how plans will turn out in practice rather than merely in theory. There might be a bit of all that in Silver Snow in particular, using Sedith and Ferdinand as driving narrative forces in the absence of any of the house leaders. Oh, and neither character is a Libra, if you were wondering. I was mostly joking about the Zodiac thing, by the way. I can only take so much of this occult stuff at once, you know? This one's a double helping of the Alliance Roundtable. One of the smaller, unsolved mysteries of the Fodlan games is that it's never explicitly stated which of Lysithia's crests she was born with, and which was artificially implanted in her by those who slither in the dark. Based on geographic proximity, I'd guess that she was born with Gloucester, since their territory is right next to Ardelia's, something that's underscored in Three Hopes, which makes the odd decision to give her a solo paralogue that's actually a team-up with Lawrence's dad. But then it's her other crest that gets remarked on more in supports, and furthermore, Gloucester is her major crest, and we know for a fact that Edelgard's implant is her major crest. It doesn't matter all that much either way, though, just like how this is the first time I'm even bringing up the distinction between major and minor crest, because it's of almost no significance in either gameplay or story, which really stands out if you played FE4 and know how much bigger of a deal Major Holy Blood is in that game. Anyway, the crest of Gloucester corresponds to L'Ermite, which at first glance seems like a poor fit for a chatty dandy like Lawrence. But in terms of what the Arcana actually signifies in a reading, this one stands out as one of the few to have some strong negative interpretations even drawn upright, interpretations that are moreover relevant to all of the characters affiliated with Gloucester. The Hermit can be indicative of treason, concealment, and disguise, all things that speak to Count Gloucester's double-dealing political maneuvers that see his allegiances ricocheting back and forth between the Alliance and Empire depending on the route and chapter. This further extends to his son, as Lawrence is one of only two characters who can defect from your army after being recruited in White Clouds, and he'll need to be defeated in combat if you want him to join again. On Lysithia's end, treachery and secrecy lie at the heart of the fate of House Ordelia and the Agarthan's deadly crest experiments. The Hermit's role along the Fool's journey is to teach us how to step away from the collective and focus on self-discovery, something we can see with how Lysithia prioritizes her own goals, sometimes above those of whatever army she happens to wind up in. Finally, there's the visual representation of the Arcana, which includes an old man carrying a staff. Gloucester's relic is, appropriately, a staff, which is more significant as Three Houses is one of the only Fire Emblem games where staves are not a distinct equipment type. Thyrsus is the strongest staff in the game too, and perfectly paired with its magically inclined crest and the two playable bearers of that crest. But mostly Lysithia, who is overall remarkably good at upstaging Lorenz at his family's own tarot-related significance. Sticking to the Alliance for the time being, we have the crest of the typically unwilling retainer of the Golden Deer, Hilda. The crest of Goneril maps to La Rue de Fortune, even down to being shaped like a wheel and its relic being an axe with a rounded, partially circular blade. That's a pretty fortunate coincidence, pun intended, because I would say that Goneril has one of the weakest associations between its tarot and its playable representative. As the name suggests, the Wheel of Fortune is overwhelmingly concerned with luck and the ups and downs of fate. Some decks also attach it to a wealth of occult symbols tied to the number 4, the 4 classical elements, the 4 suits of the minor arcana, the 4 evangelists of the Gospels, and the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. That's all well and good, and the concept of a wheel or circle tied to fate does appear in Three Houses mostly through Sothis, but Hilda? Connecting her to the Wheel of Fortune is a much tougher sell. The astrological, elemental, and biblical connections all fall flat with her. There's nothing especially tying her to the number 4 that I can think of, and more significantly, Hilda sees very little in the way of reversals of fortune across all the storylines of these games. She can potentially die in Crimson Flower and Scarlet Blaze, but apart from that, Hilda pretty much always finds herself at the top of Fortune's wheel, even in other routes where she's an NPC. Perhaps that in itself is a reflection of the Arcana, that Hilda usually turns out pretty lucky and primed for an abundant future, both of which are positive interpretations of the Wheel of Fortune. That she does this while making it all look more effortless than it really is, since, as mentioned, she definitely doesn't come across as retainer material on the surface, is another expression of her good fortune. Everything's always coming up Hilda. Skipping over the 11th Arcana that we've already talked about, we come now to the 12th. Auban is the second crest of the Ashen Wolves, this one held by Yuri and corresponding to Le Pendu, the Hanged Man. Appropriately, the crest resembles a noose. Despite the name, as well as that of Auban's relic, which is referred to as fetters, in other words, chains, this arcana doesn't really point to Yuri's criminal connections or to the ideas of imprisonment or corporal punishment. Rather, the Hanged Man is almost always depicted with a serene expression, and sometimes even a halo, pointing to an association with wisdom and enlightenment that frames the punishment as one of self-sacrifice. These traits line up with Yuri quite well, as the clever and calculating underworld leader who in Cindered Shadows acts as a triple agent to expose the forces threatening his people in Abyss. Sacrifice plays into how Yuri came to be in possession of his crest as well. As a child, he was saved from death by none other than Auban himself, who gave Yuri his blood and through it his crest. Furthermore, that the Hanged Man is upside down, and sometimes in a position reminiscent of a cross, calls to mind St. Peter, who is traditionally believed to have been crucified upside down. St. Peter was the first pope, which aligns well with Yuri's combination of leadership and religious devotion, and the Arcana as a whole marks him as a sort of underground inversion of Rhea, Fodlan's actual sort of pope, Byleth, who also got their crest via sacrificial transfusion, and the three house leaders. We all know Yuri's still not a quote-unquote real house leader, and he's never going to get anywhere near as many heroes alts as a reflection of that. but as a DLC-only character, he's quite the standout. And hey, this is one of the crests that showed up again in the first look at Fortune's Weave. No guesses yet on what that could mean, though. The next arcana is arguably the most overrepresented tarot card in all of pop culture, the dreaded unlucky 13th arcana, which is not even named in the Tarot de Marseille out of superstition, but which we all know to be death. Now, as much of a cliche as death can be whenever it's drawn, the obligatory disclaimer that accompanies it is almost as much of a cliche itself. While it does have assorted negative connotations, this arcana is not inherently a harbinger of literal death. On the contrary, it can be a sign of change from one state to another, the end of something and the beginning of something else, which is what death technically is anyway. In contrast to how it's used in tropey horror movies, Three Houses' application of the Death Tarot is remarkably understated. It's not the crest borne by the Grim Reaper-esque Death Knight, nor is its relic a scythe, although the Lance of Ruin might just have the most metal name out of the bunch. Instead, it corresponds to... Okay, rant incoming. This right here is a somewhat common French family name. In Metropolitan French, it's pronounced Gautier, while in Louisiana French, it's Gaucher. So how does Three Houses go about saying it?
I'm Sylvain José Gautier.
Call it the Death Tarot because I die a little inside every time I hear that. I can accept that Sylvain got rendered as Sylvain because English is bad at nasal vowels. Gautier, though, is just inexcusable. And if they were trying to copy how the Japanese version pronounces it, then the Japanese are wrong too. You know what? Death isn't named in some tarot decks, so just like that, I'm not going to be naming this crest because it annoys me that much. So then, the crest that will not be named does in fact align pretty neatly with elements of the Death Tarot. The crest itself has two protrusions that resemble scythes, and Sylvain himself leans a little into the black-clad knight imagery with an easily hybridized skill set that seems tailor-made to end in Dark Knight. A bit funny then that canon seems to pull him away from this role, since in Crimson Flower he shows up as a Great Knight, while in Three Hopes his default masterclass is actually Holy Knight. Some versions of the Arcana depict death as a conquering knight stepping over the body of a king, which is a grim but appropriate image if he's recruited out of house and lives to see the death of Dimitri. Usually this is interpreted with the understanding of death as a great equalizer, coming for kings and commoners alike, and in standard Fire Emblem fashion, that reading fits with every single route up to and including instances like Scarlet Blaze, where Sylvain himself gets taken out. Because this arcana is so strongly tied to the concept of change, it shouldn't be surprising that death reversed can indicate stagnation, the refusal to change. You can kind of see some of this with Sylvain's family as a whole, in their dealings with each other, as well as with the people of Srang in Sylvain's endings, and in that one Three Hopes paralogue. But change is also significant for Sylvain himself, looking for a future where he's valued for more than just his crest. Also, this is the guy that maybe introduces guns to Fodlan. The discourse surrounding him is going to get awkward should Fortune's Weave turn out to be a sequel. Oh, and I would also be remiss if I didn't remark upon Sylvain's homo-romantic death pact with Felix and the intimately morbid ending it leads to. See, death isn't always a cause for sorrow. Sometimes it's really gay. It's a little ironic that even though Hanneman is the crest scholar guy in the cast, his own crest doesn't actually receive that much attention. He and Bernadetta share the crest of Indek alongside the dragon himself, who, like Macuel, makes an appearance in a paralogue. I guess it's worth pointing out here that the surviving Nabatean characters map onto the figures of an entirely separate tradition in the Four Guardian Beasts of Chinese mythology. This is why Indek is very obviously a turtle, even though he's still a dragon in-universe. Still, Indek's form and his epithet as the Immovable do play into the arcana matching his crest, la tempérance. Another of Plato's cardinal virtues alongside justice and strength, the term temperance is usually associated with abstaining from alcohol, and this is reflected in the imagery of the arcana, which features a person or angel pouring liquid from one cup to another, a symbol of diluting wine with water. While I'd be lying if I said I was a fan of the surface level concepts here, I did recently make a video celebrating Manuela, including how she's one character who most definitely does not water down her booze. Wider themes connected to temperance like moderation, frugality, and measured action suit both the turtle hermit Indek and the meticulous researcher Hanneman, who's coincidentally made a hobby out of nagging Manuela out of her more entertaining habits. The connection to Bernadetta isn't as immediately apparent, not helped by the lack of a support line between her and her cousin, I assume, but she is indeed one of the most immovable characters in the playable cast. Interestingly, Temperance Reversed comes with multiple associations related to religion in a neutral context, fittingly for a crest affiliated with one of the saints and with the sacred weapons as opposed to the relics. But reverse temperance can also suggest competing interest, and that definitely comes into play on any route where these characters find themselves fighting the Empire while attempting to pursue their own goals of crest research and hiding in her room, respectively. As a final note, I do like what temperance signifies in the Fool's Journey as regards Bernadetta. This is the last in the second line of tarot, the final one pointing to our engagement with the material human world before the third set takes us on to an even higher, more spiritual level. In that sense, temperance instructs us to moderate our wants versus our needs so as to figure out where we fit in. Although it's not always conveyed with the most grace, since comedy very often comes first with her character, that's kind of Bernadetta's whole thing, finding ways to come out of her room and interact with others on her own terms. This one's another horror movie staple. Le Diable, the Devil, evokes a wealth of occult associations that I don't really have the time to delve that deeply into, especially because, as usual, the specific devil being referenced somewhat depends on the deck you're using. The Tarot de Marseille depicts an almost comically mismatched figure with visible genitalia and a light BDSM vibe that I'm not going to risk showing on YouTube, whereas the Rider-Waite deck only slightly dials back on the horny bits, while instead turning the central figure into Baphomet, a popular demonic symbol dating back to the Middle Ages that blends all manner of occult nonsense with conspiracy theories regarding the Catholic Church and no small amount of Islamophobia as well. And before someone wants to start talking depictions of the beast and Satan and so forth in the biblical Book of Revelation and how they connect to both this arcana and this crest, I should point out that modern Catholicism spends relatively little time dwelling on the symbology and meaning behind the Book of Revelation. That's much more of a Protestant thing these days, so it's pretty unfamiliar territory for me. Nonetheless, the crest of the beast does stand out quite a bit from the rest. It's initially unidentified and bears a common English name, traits it shares with the more plot-relevant crest of flames. The crest of the beast is also affiliated with an extra in terms of both the characters who bear it and the relics associated with it. First, there's the original bearer of the crest, Maurice, the enigmatic 11th member of the 10 elites who became the demonic wandering beast and was effectively erased from historical record even as his crest would continue to be passed down and its bearers, like Marianne, would develop a reputation for being cursed. Additionally, and even more oddly for how it's not remarked upon at all in the story, is that in-game a stone of this crest is embedded into Edelgard's axe, Aymer. Note that in some concept art, Aymer instead carries the crest I'm not naming, which is, as a reminder, connected to the Death Tarot. Aymer looks and functions like one of the 12 non-DLC relics, but it was actually created by those who slither in the dark during the time skip, making it a sort of unofficial 13th relic. This is not the first time that Fire Emblem has included a hidden 13th thing with dark implications in its world building. See also Loptus as the 13th type of holy blood in Yggdrasil. All of these elements contain some easily workable demonic associations. Le Diable upright can signify violence and predestination, while reversed it can mean weakness or blindness. It's not hard to read in these the ways in which people react to Marianne and her supposedly cursed crest, and her struggles with confronting her wandering beast ancestor. In the Fool's Journey, this arcana asks us to consider our limits and how much control we really have. Again, easy to read into Mary Ann's story of dealing with something she had no control over, and then finding the strength inside to overcome it anyway. As for Edelgard, her story is all about pushing against limits, and in a gameplay sense, Aimer allows her to push past the limit of only getting to move once per turn with a combat art that's basically Gale Force. The visuals here are also pretty on point. The crest of the beast resembles a pair of ram or devil horns, and so does Edelgard's headpiece after the time skip. If you say stuff like that too loud anywhere on the internet, people will still get angry even 6 years later, but comments drive my engagement, so have at it down below. If death or the devil is a little too cliche for your taste, but you still want to get across the idea of something dark and dramatic, your best bet is probably this arcana, La Maison Dieu, literally the House of God, but usually appearing in English as the Tower. The iconography varies, but the core theme is that of a tall building being struck by some force and people tumbling out of it. This can be linked to the story of the Tower of Babel from the Old Testament, or the harrowing of hell in Catholic tradition. But either way, this arcana is a sign of calamity and ruin. And in accordance with that, the Crest of Charon is one of the only ones with specific effects discussed in-game, during the support line between its two bearers, Catherine and Lysithea. Charon apparently has the power to summon rain, which is just a really weird superpower, sure, but it also matches the symbolism of the tower, which often depicts a lightning strike. Some French language decks even name this arcana La Foudre, lightning, a name that we also see in the combat art of Charon's relic. This is additionally another one of those crests that's designed to look like the arcana it corresponds to. Oh, and Charon is the name of the boatman in Greek mythology who ferries souls over the rivers separating life from death, so there's also that. So despite being repped by two characters who aren't all that plot relevant, and don't even move in the same narrative circles, the Crest of Charon has quite a bit in common with the Tower. Thunder Catherine is the wielder of Thunderbrand. Lysithea has a lot of catastrophe baked into her story, and both characters have to contend against adversity. There's not much of the Tower reversed here, which has traits of inaction like negligence or apathy, but in terms of the Fool's Journey, it signifies a great collapse and the need to break free from unstable constraints. Whether that's Lysithea's struggles against the experimentation that defined the course of her life, or Catherine redefining her role as Rhea's guardian in the endings where both survive and they retire together. It's all about adapting to that new world order, possibly with a side of religiously kinky lesbianism, if you choose to go there. Let's take a break from that heaviness now with a sequence of 3 more positive arcana, each of them depicting a celestial body. L'Étoile, the star, is the arcana connected to Happy's crest, so we've got another DLC situation on our hands. What little we learn about Timotheos is that he was one of the 4 apostles, and he had a particular affinity for sighing and animals. So we're just retrofitting Happy's traits onto the source of her crest. But this is probably going to come up again in Fortune's Weave, so get ready for the demonic beast world building to get weird. Looking at the arcana itself, there are a few elements to consider here. The large star in the middle is surrounded by 7 smaller stars, while a nude woman pours out 2 jugs, one into water and the other onto land, while she also has 1 foot in the water and 1 on land. In this, the star is greatly similar to the Temperance Arcana, and astrologically it's tied to Aquarius, which only doubles down on the whole water-bearer thing. Interpretations of the star, though, vary quite a bit, with some sources tying it to hope and healing, and others giving even its upright readings negative aspects like loss and privation. As such, it's difficult to pin down much in particular with regard to Happy. The crest of Timotheos doesn't even really look like a star or use the same number of points, even though that would have been easy to replicate. It does somewhat resemble Balthus's crest flipped upside down, which corresponds to the Sun Arcana, but that's about it. You could read the privation trait as something pointing to Happy's imprisonment and to the experiments that were done on her, with a need to grow beyond that trauma over the course of the game, not unlike a more positive spin on what we saw with the Tower and how that arcana relates to Lysithea. But it's kind of a shame that the Tarot's overt focus on water and healing was overlooked with Happy. Happy's birthday even just missed out on making her an Aquarius by about a week, which is extra disappointing since as a blithely unconventional free spirit, she'd be the most stereotypical Aquarius imaginable. If you were to look at Claude's crest, and I told you to guess which occult-flavored symbol it's associated with, you'd probably get it right in one. It's La Lune, the Moon Arcana. But that seems off, doesn't it? Claude is very much not the Lord in this game associated with the Moon, so on the surface this looks like a complete visual design mismatch. You could maybe look at the crest of Blathid and see it as the halo of light surrounding a full moon, but come on, Regan is just flat out a crescent moon. But Claude's crest also looks an awful lot like something else, the traditional symbol for wind magic in Fire Emblem. Now that sounds a lot more up Claude's alley, since he's the lord of verdant wind, and a few of his character and design elements were lifted from Yggdral's resident wind mage and Prince Incognito Lewin. So call this one a fortunate coincidence. As is the case with a lot of lunar symbology in Western occult traditions, the Moon Arcana is tied to things like illusion and deception. The canine figures howling at the moon superficially evoke werewolf mythology, although Dimitri is again the stronger match there. But then there's also a crawfish on here, which as a New Orleanian I find very odd, even if it's attempting to tie this arcana to the astrological water signs. As we may expect at this point, Claude is not a water sign. What he is, though, is the most secretive of the house leaders, and the one who's thinking of the biggest picture, as the only one to really care about the world outside of Fodlan. I can see the role of the moon in the tarot here as kind of what Golden Wildfire attempts to do with Claude's character, where he's trying to illuminate the truth of the war between the Empire and the Kingdom, and in so doing prevail over everyone, the lesser animal natures that the figures represent in some interpretations. How effective that is, we'll never know, because the Roots and Three Hopes don't have real endings. But since the Moon Arcana is all about illusion anyway, you're free to read who's really being tricked in whichever way is most flattering to your particular Blorbo. The moon reversed can instead point to stability and constancy, which Claude selectively can be depending on the root. I suppose in his case it really is just a matter of which way the card is drawn. What if I were to tell you that possibly what I consider to be the most well-thought-out tarot association for a non-plot relevant character in Three Houses comes to us in the form of Balthus? It's really easy to overlook this guy. He's paid DLC, he's goofy comic relief most of the time, and his sex appeal is of a kind that lies well outside Fire Emblem's target demographic. But his crest, which I want to call Chevalier, but which I believe the game says something like Chevalier, corresponds to Le Soleil, the sun, and is, in just about every way, a perfect foil to Claude and his crest. The two characters share a similar biracial backstory, and it's for that reason that Balthus is the only character in Three Houses who successfully pegs that Claude is half Almiran, albeit mostly because he wants to sleep with Claude's mom. And despite that similarity, Balthus's personality is totally unlike Claude's. Befitting of the Sun Arcana, Balthus is an open book, sometimes to an embarrassing degree. I can also see him revealing the truth of Claude's origins in their support conversations as a reflection of how the Arcana represents attained knowledge in contrast to the secrecy of the moon, and how this revelatory quality manifests in the crest design, calling to mind the sun climbing over the horizon. From a player's perspective, it's easy to take for granted knowing that Claude is the Prince of Almyra, but keep in mind that that information is never shared anywhere else outside of his ending cards in Three Houses, and in a limited availability paralogue in Three Hopes. Truly, Balthus exists to illuminate. These characters are even comparable on a gameplay level, since they're the only 2 units to boast 6 positive skill traits. There's not a ton of overlap between their specific strengths and weaknesses, but that's probably to be expected. And beyond all that, Balthus is just one of the sunniest characters in the cast, appropriately so when his corresponding arcana is among the most positive in the deck. Even the sun reversed is more indicative of temporary setbacks than anything truly negative. Where the moon arcana shines on wild animals, the sun instead shines on one or more children, so innocence and freedom and so forth. Balthus, hard-drinking womanizer that he is, would be tough to label as innocent, but he is, at the very least, the endlessly sunny king of grappling. The penultimate major arcana is another weighty philosophical one, le jugement, or judgment. It's rather difficult to discuss the iconography of this tarot without considering its overt Christian elements. It depicts a scene of the Last Judgment, of an angel resurrecting the dead upon the second coming of Jesus. Even the more pagan-flavored Rider-Waite deck doesn't fundamentally alter this image, and even clarifies the flag on the angel's trumpet as that of St. George, a militaristic symbol for a militaristic saint which for centuries was associated with the Crusades. The arcana itself is unsurprisingly connected to some heavily Christian concepts as well, including rebirth, renewal, and, of course, judgment. So now let's apply that to the Lamine siblings. Technically, there's also this guy in the Fortune's Weave trailer who's rocking the same crest and who basically looks like Yaritza 2.0, but we'll have to save that for when we actually know something about that game. Mercedes and Yaritza each suit judgment quite well in their own ways. Theologically speaking, the event marks the separation of the saved from the damned. Mercedes is one of the most overtly religious members of the cast, while Yaritza very much isn't. You try leveling his faith rank. That said, the siblings share a morbid fascination with the undead, whether that's Mercedes and her love of ghosts, or her brother's more straightforward edgelord alter ego. The theme of repentance comes up repeatedly in Yaritza's support lines, but most especially with Mercedes since he first got his bloodlust when he was trying to protect her, and she's consistently his most frequent source of sympathy. Forgiveness is a major element of their relationship, matching what judgment signifies along the Fool's Journey. Their paired ending is notably the only one where Yaritza actually serves time for the murders he's committed, and in Three Hopes, the siblings' connection to each other is so strong that each of them is the sole reason that the other can ever be recruited out of their base route. I can even look at Mercedes' excessively complicated backstory, wherein she's had to contend with not one but 2 awful stepfathers, as a reflection of judgment indicating a change of position or renewal, particularly in the instance where her salvation comes at the expense of her brother's damnation. Not unlike the Crest of Lamine itself, these siblings' stories are remarkably symmetrical. Here at last we've made it to the end, the final arcana, Le Monde, the world. This crest is the big one, the one seen on the loading screen, the one that appears as Fodlan's very own Fire Emblem in some routes, and the one possessed by Byleth, Sothis, and, thanks to those who slither in the dark, Edelgard as well. This arcana represents the end of the Fool's Journey, where Fire Emblem's resident fool Anna finds completion and leaves Fodlan to be promptly left out of the family reunion and engaged because no one actually cares about Fodlan Anna. But we care plenty about the Crest of Flames, because this is the one that hits all the game's high notes. The antagonism and/or attraction between Byleth and Edelgard is effectively the narrative centerpiece of every root of Three Houses, including those where it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, like in Verdant Wind. Even in Three Hopes, where Byleth is barely relevant to the story and an optional recruit, the writing just can't stop pushing the supernatural, possibly crest-driven connection between them and Edelgard. And Sothis, well, she's literally living rent-free in Byleth's head, has to function as their voice during White Clouds, gets a big dramatic merger with them, and then even has the potential to pop back in at the end so she and Byleth can get married. And with the Fortune's Weave trailer teasing us with the prospect of adult Sothis bringing Byleth back for another game, we can look forward to more of these two in the future. Sothis might be called the beginning, but in terms of tarot, she's right here at the end. And that makes perfect sense for what we see in the World Arcana, depicting a figure surrounded by a wreath, or in some cases an Ouroboros, a snake or dragon eating its own tail for some obvious beginning and end symbolism. The figure in the middle is sometimes interpreted as androgynous, which puts me immediately in mind of Fire Emblem avatars and how I previously described them as non-binary in a way that only video game characters can be, where they have a binary gender but it's player-chosen and subject to change. While this is not something that's ever explored in the script, I do think this aligns a little better with male Byleth having a goddess inside of his head, and how that leads to a certain ambiguity of gender. But I'm almost certainly giving the writers too much credit there. Other interpretations, however, describe the central figure as female, specifically prudence or wisdom representing the fourth and final of Plato's cardinal virtues. So if you want an easier female Byleth interpretation that also incorporates Sothis and Edelgard, there you go. The World Arcana also displays a motif of the number 4, with the figures in the corner standing for the 4 classical elements with the matching fixed zodiac signs, or alternatively the 4 creatures from the Book of Ezekiel. In Three Houses terms, that's the 4 roots, or possibly the 4 houses if we're willing to count the wolves. The overall impression of this arcana is, as mentioned, that of completion and totality. The world upright is seen as a sign of voyages, change, and travel, while reversed it can indicate either permanence or stagnation. Simultaneously the positive and negative traits of the fixed astrological signs. I don't think I need to outline how all of the above is relevant to characters who lie at the very heart of the Fodlan game's stories and are always influencing them in some way. I don't think that reading the Crest of Flames as Byleth being torn between the two opposing poles of Sothis and Edelgard really works, especially in contrast to the antagonism between Rhea and Edelgard represented by the Crest of Saros. But on that more meta Lord versus Avatar level, it comes across a little more smoothly, even if all of this is hampered by Byleth's total inability to carry a story as a flat self-insert. They are the world in the sense that they can stand in for anyone playing the game. They can do anything or be anything, unless it's ignoring gender lock or getting gay with around 80% of the playable cast, that is. But other than that, the world lies open before them. So that's a not-so-little overview of tarot in the Fodlan games. Is this going to come up again in Fortune's Weave? Probably, because Fire Emblem loves its lightly recycled elements, and that's doubly true whenever there's a sequel or prequel or whatever this new game is supposed to be. But how do you feel about what the game does with its crest symbolism? Do your own readings for these characters, as it were. As with everything related to the occult, this is all very much subject to personal interpretation. And don't forget to also like the video and subscribe to my channel, especially if you're looking forward to Fortune's Weave and want to see what else develops as we get more information on that game. Thanks for watching, everyone. Au revoir.